Hello, morning. So 15 minutes it is, off we go. The first thing to mention is that all the images in the PowerPoint are mine, but they were taken during the Industrial Biennial of Contemporary Art in Ekaterinburg last year. So the title is a kind of a reflection on the theme of the conference and my conversations with Ludmila, particularly as regards the place of the program and particularly the research that's been carried out here vis-a-vis our understanding of the new economies and a kind of a global crisis of knowledge production and a kind of a new wave of neoliberalism. And obviously, the first image that you see here is a reference to what's been kind of branded in the West as disenfranchised people who are kind of left behind, the ones who Sarah Wilson defined as the Brexit voters yesterday. And to me, it's a kind of a glass ceiling situation where people can observe what's going on. They can sort of see that change, that transformation is taking place. But there is a bigger question about participation in that change and the role that is kind of being assigned to various subjectivities. The wider context for this is kind of a larger project that I'm involved in, which has to do with Russian and Russophone communities and symbolic economies emerging in various countries in the world. I'm interested simultaneously in sort of top-down symbolic production, for example, television channels such as RT, but also grassroots movement. And they vary enormously as we look at different producers. So, for example, last year, Rita, who will be speaking after me, invited me to give a talk about restaurants that make burgers, and I kind of use that as a symbol to talk about that change in the notion of value and symbolic economies and how they function in the new globalized world. So just to give you a sense of the biennial, this is possibly the most important event when it comes to contemporary art in the Russian Federation and the Russian language world. There's been 4 iterations of this event. Most recent one was in 2017, and there's going to be another one this year in 2019. It's already causing some controversies, but I imagine they'll be resolved when the time comes. And so this is a kind of artistic cultural context for the research that I want to talk about. The theme for the biennial in 2017 was new literacy, which at that time was conceived of as a kind of a set of new types of knowledge, a new set of skills, and a new way of making things, including kind of the notion of that intellect, artificial intelligence as well. And generally kind of new relations that are being carried out and built across the world. So I was involved in carrying out some research for the biennial. Or rather my kind of idea for the team was to try to kind of rethink the very notion of the art and contemporaneity. It's very important that the words contemporary art are kind of used as a coin all the time to mean a particular artistic trend, a particular kind of a social or political or aesthetic movement. I wonder whether we can actually talk about contemporaneity in other ways as well that kind of go beyond the discourse. And I'm obviously interested in the thinking of the people from the 1990s that already started thinking along the lines of what happens to the contemporary and how it can be utilized for political, economic, social, all kinds of ways. And particularly I'm interested in the way we can measure, estimate, assess, investigate what we mean by symbolic economies. So just to be precise, the research was carried out in 2017 and a bit more in 2018, and it took us some time to actually produce the report. And this is the report over here. I'm going just to pass it over for you to have a look at if you're interested, if you don't mind. Can you just so this is a small volume that we authored together as a team. There were, I think, 5 of us working on the final report. But what I'm actually going to talk about is me going back to those findings and trying to conceptualize them in a new way, trying to see what we actually found out back then. The idea is, of course, is that you need distance to understand what sort of process you were involved in and how you can actually theorize your findings. To be more specifically, I was interested in trying to map that sort of process of bringing, showing, exhibiting, thinking about art and contemporaneity. We also looked at some historical data, but particularly, and that was our kind of main method, we engaged with thinkers all around the world, trying to do interviews with them, see what they think about a range of questions that we had for them. So who were those people? I can put them into those groups there. Curators and organizers of biennials and similar cultural festivals and sort of, art fairs, whatnot. Researchers and educators, and obviously those two categories are the obvious ones, right? If you're really looking at that context, these are the kind of key stakeholders in those processes. We were also interested in actually knowing what people think about the contemporary in actual industry, where people make things. So we reached out to them as well. They were also kind of people that fall out from the usual brackets of researchers and educators and professors. So I termed them as thinkers. And eventually we kind of looked at situations where people merge their interest in the contemporary with their business activities. So the last category is probably the most interesting one. So let me just talk about a couple of people here that we interviewed. One of them is based in Moscow. I'm not going to be giving names, but you can find sort of the information in the booklet that I passed around. Based in Moscow with a great interest and kind of enthusiasm about contemporary art, but whose primary role is to be a hedge bank investor. So he runs a company that makes investments into startups in the Russian Federation, but also globally. And so it's a person who is in charge of assessing actually what is going to make money in the future and what kind of capital they can generate from those activities. The other person started as a producer of animated films and eventually became the director of one of the largest and most successful IT companies in the Russian Federation. It's a company that releases full-feature digitally animated films that are sold to 149 countries in the world. And so I was trying to kind of trace his career and see how literally over the course of 3 years, that sort of a startup business went big way. So by talking to those people, by mapping the events, by engaging with people on the ground, we found out that there are certain trends in understanding of the role of art design and the future industries. And so in the time remaining, I'd like to go through some of them. And what I did is I tried to kind of put them into certain categories for us to have a better sense of where we're moving. All the speakers talked about how they really are uncomfortable with the term object, right, or a thing, or an item that they use in their work. And they really suggested to move towards what I labeled as new materialism. This is, of course, a reference to the convergence of all kinds of spaces, including digital and physical, or what has been labeled as phygital spaces. But I think it's a general kind of anxiety and enthusiasm about that sort of new kind of materiality that has emerged post-2008 financial crisis, which is about new socialities. It is about new connections and what can be offered to prosumers around the world. All interviewees agreed on that the future will be about this multi-vector, multi-speed economies, and that there will be economic opportunities for those who can actually play with those multi-speed economies. Now, back in 2017, I really struggled to understand what they mean, but now that we are almost halfway through Brexit, I think I'm getting a better sense of what they meant, and that is a country like the UK is now basically managing and playing with time on the global scale, extending deadlines and kind of manipulating economic activities in Europe, but also globally. And so that is a kind of a first sign of how we can shift into that production of time and relations that are rooted in this kind of economic setup. A bit that I'm also interested in is that they talked a lot about how they wish to be more efficient in their work, in their practice. And it's very interesting that they were very uncritical about the effects of that efficiency on actual personnel, on people, on human beings. It seems as if efficiency in itself has become a kind of a super value, and human rights and kind of, the well-being of the people is, or rather, was described as less important or something they didn't comment on. And so even when they talked about their own role, they would be talking about how they use all their free time in order to become more efficient, to kind of, learn new stuff, etc. And so there is a sense of that, our everyday existence is turning into some kind of a capital that's being produced and reinterpreted. There were some unexpected findings, or rather findings that we struggle to theorize in any kind of meaningful way. And one of them was that the majority of speakers refer to the nation state as a foundation for that new economy. This goes along the kind of strand of thinking from the 1990s, where when we talked about the future, we talked about the dissolution of the nation-state system, the end of the nation-state, a kind of a post-nation condition. So it's very interesting that that's been brought back into the kind of picture where the nation-state is an entity through which and around which people will operate. As I'm kind of running out of time, I'm going to now look at some findings that were specific to the Russian Federation as we're here. Lots of speakers, including very established educators and researchers, talked about inequalities through consumption. They talked about how art is used as a marker of social differences, of economic differences, of differences of meaning. They also talked about how that sort of new emerging symbolic economy in the Russian Federation is a kind of a new platform where social conflicts will be carried out in the future. There was a lot of emphasis placed on space. Now, we need to be mindful of that. The interviews and the whole debate took place already after the annexation of Crimea, so there was a sense of a kind of an emerging space for a lot of speakers that commented on the context. And they also alluded to the fact that perhaps what Russia is kind of going through is a process of de-Westernization. By that, they did not mean turning away from the West, but rather turning and engaging with other centers of globalization, other centers of symbolic economies such as China, but they would also refer to South America as well. They also noted some authoritarian trends, not necessarily referring to political structures and kind of the notion of the regime as such, but rather this obsession with certain individuals and certain kind of categories that dominate the discourse about the contemporary. Such as, for example, they criticized the obsession with Kabakov and kind of his art, which is used as a way to represent Russian art and kind of contemporary art globally, as if there are no other artists. And I'm just going to finish with this slide over here and invite questions, if I may. So what do I make of these sort of discussions in relation to the Russian Federation? What struck me, and this is a kind of a big idea that I wish to develop in my future research, is how actually there is no break between the agenda that was set up in the 1980s and contemporary agenda in the Russian Federation. And yes, the country has gone through an enormous evolution in the 1990s and in the noughties, but it seems like those seeds of neoliberalism that were planted by Gorbachev in the 1980s are still there with us. And they are the ones that actually are still fueling the economy and the thinking of all these very powerful people here. And so I'm just going to conclude with this sort of exciting but idea that there is a greater recognition of the role of art as a new area of symbolic production. But sadly, all the speakers that came from the Russian Federation did not include it into the kind of mainstream or major part of the country's economy. So it is still seen as a kind of a byproduct or a kind of a substrand or less important area of economic activity. But I imagine that that can change in the future. Thank you. Are we doing questions now or? Yeah.
Do you have any questions? Thank you a lot, by the way, for the wonderful presentation. Do you have any questions? Okay, please.
Many thanks, Vlad, for this fantastic presentation. I have two questions for you. Very interesting results, especially that ones concerning Russian specifics. Question one is, as far as I know, you presented this research in Yekaterinburg during the Biennale. Unfortunately, I missed that one. So I'm wondering, did they find your results surprising, or they just agreed with them? And the second one, I would learn more about, how do you call it, consumption wars or consumption battles? So, and what are main competitors of contemporary art in these battles in Yekaterinburg or in bigger cities as Moscow?
As for the first question, let me just kind of reiterate that this is new stuff. I did not present it way back in Yekaterinburg. So just there, the presentation was more about the kind of the spaces of the art and kind of the contemporary in that setting. And so the reaction was actually very positive. They were interested in kind of knowing that what they do is kind of gaining that sort of global attention in many ways. And they were excited to see that there are people now out there in kind of strange places in many ways that would know about the event, right? So that was kind of the emphasis. So in a way, it was more about self-recognition and kind of placing themselves on that sort of global map and trying to figure out what to do with that. I think that was along those lines. As for the second question, that was actually a translation from Russian into English. So one of the interviews actually used that term. And that... Потребительские войны. Yeah. So that was the stuff. But what they really meant by those consumption battles is not actually kind of real fighting. You know, it's more about that those differences in consumption and social identity, to quote Bourdieu, are a source of antagonisms, right? That was actually seen not as a kind of a question of competition, not as a kind of a potential for growth, which would be the language used in Britain, for example, right? That we would talk about that along the lines of, you know, there is potential for growth, but rather that there was a bit of a kind of anxiety about that is actually happening. That was actually seen to an extent as a kind of a, I don't know, threat to an existing order rather than an economic opportunity or an individual kind of personal opportunity of any kind. I found that very interesting, but I probably need to either go back to the interview or actually speak to this person again. And this is what I should probably do in the future, which is to kind of re-engage with those people and see how they would sort of comment on the developments since 2016-17.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay.
Feel free to ask questions in Russian, by the way. Можно по-русски.
Well, still in English. Thank you for the presentation. I was thinking about Natasha Komarova's research on narrative in Russian art markets, and so the research was about the narrative of crisis of late 2020s, 2020s, and so she explored this power of a narrative of disruption. And I was wondering if, because you presented, like you emphasized the stability of ideas and kind of narratives that guides this sphere, at least in this particular city, right? You kind of referred to 90s, and that's still kind of this neoliberal ideas as they were at the start were still there at this moment. And is there any kind of disruption, feeling of crisis in there? Because that research was only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, so in kind of bigger art market centers. And is there anything similar in Yekaterinburg, or it's kind of one, like, is there any temporality, any dynamics in their perception of this sphere in their city?
Thank you. That's a great point of reference there. Thank you very much. So let me try to clarify, and I'm sorry I wasn't clear. So just to confirm that only half of the interviewees were based in the Russian Federation, but all of them had the experience of kind of working and living globally. So in a way, we interviewed, in all honesty, very privileged individuals who kind of have the experience and capacity to think in ways that perhaps you know, not available to everyone. And those were those individuals, right, that would define what's going on in those terms. I was just kind of reporting and analyzing what they said. There was indeed a different kind of a sense of what's going on site in Yekaterinburg among the people who were there. Of course, people who were involved in staging the biennial were living through a crisis. You know, the paintings did not arrive, or the video was not working. So there was this sort of perpetual sense of crisis. And so I think it was probably wrong just to kind of take that as a sense of what was happening. I didn't really have a chance to engage with many individuals in that city, but over the past 10 years, I've interviewed many cultural producers there. And the notion of crisis or the narrative of uncertainty was not listed as a kind of a top concern, which I find actually interesting, kind of exciting. Arguably, that region is unique to the Russian Federation, politically, socially, media-wise, etc. So perhaps one of the reasons why uncertainty is not kind of placed so high. And also it's a city with that sort of global ambition, you know, bidding for Expo 2020 and whatnot all the time. So there is a kind of a sense of that the community are certain about their ability to produce that future.
A famous picture by Caspar David Friedrich, who is a great painter of German Romanticism from 19th century. But yeah, that's a famous picture, but slightly less famous than his masterpiece, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Folk, which represents male figure, and often it's interpreted, the other one is interpreted as figure of artists, typical for Romanticism. So I'm trying to be a bit subversive here, providing with you with a female version and trying to interpret female figure as an artist. And you can see beautiful sunrise here. So maybe some of the speakers who left in the UK enjoying something like that currently because of time difference. But anyway, talking about non-representation, which is, I would say, the main strand of research when we talk about gender inequality in the arts. Here, I would start with a famous example of the Bechdel test. So Alison Bechdel wasn't an academic; she was a creative herself. And actually, she became famous by producing these short comics. So two ladies are gonna see some movie, and one of them says that she's got 3 simple requirements to a movie to see. First, there has to be at least two women in the film. Second, they should talk to each other on something beside a man. And actually, it's not that great amount of movies that actually satisfy these requirements. And because of Bechdel tests, there have been an array of research evolved on non-representation on females in film. So followed by many studies of inequalities, of gender inequalities in film production, like the recent one is EVA project on European film industry, and here carried out in 7 countries, and here you can see that women are less represented in film schools, in the industry, even less represented. Only 1/4 of film producers are females, and even less in the distribution of public funding. So only 14%. So that's movie industry. But you may ask, like, what about other industries like visual art? Well, same thing, basically. So the famous example from which is artwork, again, but started huge academic discussion. That's a poster by Guerrilla Girls group. I'm sure you heard about that, but because that's morning, I will let myself remind you. So they published a poster with a striking question asking, do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Because less than 5, actually the original version, so that's later, original version was 4, as far as I remember. 5% of the artists in the modern art section are women, but 85 of the nudes are female. So statistically, you will have more chances to enter the museum as a naked model than artists. And again, there are a lot of examples of inequalities in terms of representation. I have my own example coming from Russian art scene from the 90s. So I can't spend too much time explaining the scene, but what you can clearly identify. So that's social network analysis made together with Garage Museum, their archive, which analyzed data of main art periodicals from the 90s. And what I found that actually, well, that was really precarious scene, with insufficient funds, with lack of prestige, because this area was rather new for Russian Federation of that time. But nevertheless, we might see that. So green ones, female artists or critics, and it's less than 1/5 of all the amount of producers. And when it comes to critics, again, just 36 of them are female. And you may also see when you look at the picture that actually women are less central and less connected. Yeah, so the situation can't be taken positively, really. Still, well, Of course, there are a lot of attempts to fix the situation, both bottom up with activism, feminist activism in the field, and some top down policies more open to women, but still the situation can be just called bad. But what I'm trying to do here is I'm not saying that's not important anymore, but what I'm about to suggest here is to slightly change the research optics by introducing a group of creative workers of my special interests who are the invisible workers, as I call them. One of the examples of such groups involved in arts and creative industries, institution workers, cultural institution workers, as museums left behind the scene, and to explain their invisibility, I would use this powerful example by conceptual artist Michael Escher, who produced his early work with no title. It was exhibited in LA in Claire Copley Gallery in 70s. So what he did, he was commissioned by so that's a commercial gallery, and he's got a commission. And instead of putting some drawings or objects there in gallery space, what he did, he just removed the wall between the gallery space and the office. And by doing that, he made the invisible workers visible. Of course, we can discuss, like, maybe for some of you it can be taken as violating act, but also it kind of opens up the new problem, the problem of visibility. So metaphorically, and I hope I am doing that safely and smoothly, I'm doing the same. So I'm removing the wall in between visible and invisible in the art world, and to give you some idea of what I did, that was ethnographic study, which took me like 6 years to collect all the interviews and observation, and that was a comparative study. And what I really like here in this section is a comparative aspect, and I hope we will have a discussion on that later. So I had 4 cases, 4 types of institutions. I took both public and private sector in 2 countries, the UK and Russia. So in particular, I looked at public and private cultural institutions in London, private top-down institutions in Moscow, and public and private cultural institutions in St. Petersburg. And because that's rather a short talk today, I would focus especially on my Russian case, because it is very interesting in terms of gender. So what do we know about creative labor studies? Because of some British scholars absent so far, as Angela McRobbie, but also David Hesmondhalgh and Rosalind Gale. Yes, these areas, they're full of inequalities, and they can be, oh, I just have 5 minutes, fantastic. Especially, well, based on gender, and what I want to emphasize there, that that's a certain gap between the beautiful picture of Bohemians lifestyle. We can easily fancy when we talk about creative work and routine. They face every day. So this mundane creative work implies, in the Russian case, huge amount of paperwork, which reinvents the meaning of creativity. Like, according to one of the interviewees, a curator from St. Petersburg, creativity is when you fight with all the bureaucratic obstacles and finally sign a short-term contract, which is called, well, GmbH, some of you might understand. Yeah, which is challenging, and according to him, so that's he. That's one of the main skills of real curator. So in this reversed, invisible world, creativity means signing and formulating contracts, not only creating conceptions for exhibition, not only handing out with artists and beautiful restaurants, but something else. And if we still take the optics of Bourdieu, and we argue that actually all the creative workers fighting for higher prestige and higher visibility, what shall we take as prestige here? And the model I would suggest here, and I think I hope to open some questions, and will not provide you with immediate answers. So, but what the scheme I would suggest here. So yeah, that's a pyramid of creativity, and we've got three. That's multi-dimensional, and we've got three factors here. As from what I found in my Russian field, but also can be applied to British and other, creativity, invisibility, or visibility, and pay. And if we look at the foundation of this pyramid, we can find here invisible, unpaid, and non-creative. To give you a bit of explanation, I'm not measuring creativity. I just take what they consider creative or non-creative. So that's usually work for interns or volunteers. Then when we go higher, we deal with visible, paid, and non-creative formal technical work. The better is invisible, paid, unpaid, but creative work. In terms of cultural institutions, that's usually informal work considered creative. So, for example, someone who's employed as a manager or technical worker, thank you, work as a curator. And the top of this pyramid is visible, paid, and creative work, but only few workers in one institution can occupy this position. So usually that's curator or curator-in-chief. And what's the question I want to ask here is that, I mean, how do we place gender here? Because gender in this country, with huge female predominance in the sector, like that, I have both qualitative and quantitative proof of that, like more than 70%, according to statistics, and even more of what I found in the field, in cultural institutions, they are females. But does it mean that actually there is less of inequalities here? And my idea is to analyze inequality, gender-based inequality, as numerous choices. Sometimes, well, they are forced to make choice inside this pyramid. And, well, if you look at the top, usually, so that's obviously gender cross. So the directors of cultural institutions are mostly male. But if you look at the foundation, the young volunteers being very enthusiastic, they are females. And there is something in between. And it's not direct discrimination, but that's multifactored inequalities rooted in this system. So I think I will stop myself here, and that's a big question mark for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. And here I'd like to invite some questions. Do we have any? Yes.
Thank you, Rita. I want to leave the kind of interpretation for probably a broader discussion, but I'm interested in the kind of in the start of what you said, and particularly how you basically structured your thinking, and that is, it strikes me as a very binary approach, and I really wanted to ask you about the way you conducted the interviews and the way you asked people to disclose their gender, and whether the options were male, female, or other, or undisclosed, or something else. Because I feel like that by shifting the focus onto women, you do a fantastic job bringing them into visibility, but you also lock yourself in that sort of a binary gender system. So I'm just curious about sort of how you proceeded with your work.
Well, many thanks for your question, Vlad. And in most cases, so I didn't ask them to feel like a questionnaire, like tick the box, the gender box. So and I didn't ask them like what's your gender, but it came naturally in the interview. So they would say as a man or as a woman, something like that. So I didn't have non-binary interviews or those from other genders. I had some, well, that's another question, but I had some who would identify themselves as queer. They told me like, well, we're straight, but very few of them. Yes, so it is an interesting question, because like what I also found, and I didn't have a lot of time to explore this issue, that gender doesn't create solidarity. Like I even had an example, which is excerpt from one of the interviews taken in St. Petersburg, and actually she was a young female manager who fired older female workers and brought another female workforce of younger age. And in this case, age worked as a basis for solidarity. So, but yeah, today it was more like women and visibility, but I would definitely explore masculinities, femininities in my next presentations. Thank you.
Можно я по-русски? Спасибо огромное за очень интересную презентацию. У меня даже не вопрос, а ремарка, наверное, скорее, потому что я слушала доклад и думала о темах, которыми я занимаюсь, и где есть похожая проблематика. Она не связана с гендером и invisibility, а с вот этой жаждой креативности. Потому что у меня довольно часто возникает ощущение, что это стало своего рода обсессией для современного человека безотносительно рода его занятий очень часто. И для многих быть креативными или иметь креативную работу – это буквально значит быть счастливыми, а не иметь ее, соответственно, априори не быть таковыми. Можем ли мы говорить о том, что это служит своего рода поводом для притока кадров в эту сферу, да, потому что кураторское дело и креативная индустрия воспринимаются как вот это место, где можно обрести это счастье, которое в других местах недоступно, и поэтому они в некотором роде новые люди, которые приходят в эту индустрию, подпитывают вот эту иерархию, которую вы обнаружили, что креативное, но неоплачиваемое будет квалифицироваться как более престижное, чем некреативное, но хорошо оплачиваемое.
Да, это очень интересный вопрос, и я думаю, это такой глобальный тренд, который можно обнаружить. Я уже по-русски буду отвечать тоже, не только в России, но и в других сферах, и это очень зависит от того, в качестве кого творческие работники начинают путь, потому что то, что меня удивило, и одна из моих находок именно в России, это то, что те, кто занимается, начинает путь через профессиональное образование, которое может быть очень длительным. Например, молодые художники, которых я изучала, обнаружилось, что 6-7 лет – это старт их карьеры. То есть очень рано. То есть для них, может быть, за счет того, что они очень долго уже этим занимаются, творческая специальность позиционируется как такая нормальная работа. То есть ты можешь быть инженером, а можешь быть художником. И это очень не похоже на то, о чем пишет, например, Энджела Макроби, которую еще раз я упомяну сейчас, потому что в британском случае, то, что, согласно ее находкам, это такой выбор между скучной, но стабильной работой и увлекательным путешествием как художника, как модельера и так далее. Вот то, что я нашла, это нормальная работа, но как раз действительно вы правы. Те, кто приходят как волонтеры, и, может быть, они работают сами в банковском секторе, и таких достаточно много было в случае московских культурных институций, которых я изучала. Да, они приходят с определенными амбициями, не всегда с профессиональным бэкграундом, и начинают действительно с нетворческой, неоплачиваемой и не креативной, но их ожидания достаточно высокие. То есть, по идее, конечно, они хотели бы оказаться на верху этой пирамиды, но максимум, к чему ведут эти карьерные пути, то, что я смогла наблюдать, это все-таки не творческая работа, которая была частично оплачиваема. Возможно, две верхние позиции, да, это совсем другой трек. Да, и в этом смысле, опять же, я хотела подчеркнуть значимость формального профессионального образования в России до сих пор. И, кстати, интересно, вот последний комментарий к этому вопросу, это то, что какие слова, да, они используют для описания этой работы, потому что, это разные, как бы, такие облака, да, концептуальные, творческое и креативное в России, которые два разных слова, и еще культурное, да, которое строго привязано к идеям высокой культуры и закреплено за государством до определения. Вот, поэтому, творческим может быть очень много вещей, креативным меньше, а культурным, наверное, еще меньше. Это только профессиональная сфера с жестко определенными иерархиями и компетенциями. Спасибо за вопрос. Хороший вопрос.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, and I think your last slide was last quotation shows that maybe it would make more sense not to kind of count how many women are on these different levels, but rather look or combine that, look at their creative teams of different organizations, because here, like, it clearly showed this quotation that past dependency and how the entrance into the organization was kind of accomplished matters in the final set of people who will be working there in the end. All these connections between, like, if the boss is young female, then she would probably want for certain positions also young females, right? And what if they're how the team would form if the boss is male, and so on, because especially in this sphere, I guess it's so important how, like, your first negotiations is done, and it's very, very informal usually. And I'm just thinking, like, of my own example. Recently, I was me and a friend, a colleague of mine, also female, was hired for a research project into a foundation that was developing festivals in small towns. So they wanted to know more about the towns where they work, and I know that there was, like, me, my colleague, and another team, like former sociological agency with guys in there. And I clearly knew the moment in our meeting when we had all this kind of, we're all girls here of different age, but we have similar jokes and kind of we know what we mean. And that was a big deal in hiring us, because, like, there was shared experience, shared understanding of what's going on and what's, like, lifestyle approaches basically. And I guess it's kind of here, it's not only about different hierarchical levels, but also this past dependency, how the team is formed depending of who hires and how it's all happening actually.
Well, thank you, Varvara, for your comment or question. But anyway, I'll reply, and fantastic. Yeah, thank you for bringing the fantastic example of your own experience table. Yeah, and the way I would also unpack this particular quotation is transformation or transition, because it is very important that actually that's public organization, and these old ladies in Russian, their origin was tetushki, as she said. So these tetushki, they worked there for years, and they have quite normal day regime and structure of work organization. So they had some time to have tea parties, which is good. We all should have some time for tea parties, some time at work. But she's like a classical neoliberal efficient manager. And so this, like, paradigm shift works here as well. And as I got you right, you mentioned that the possibility of calculations. So how many women are there and not there? But I would refer here to Catherine Giuffre's metaphor on, so yeah, they are climbing, but it's not like Rock Mountain, that's a sand pile. And all this system of statuses, it is very informal, and it changed like fairly quickly. So yeah, I don't believe in possibility of calculation here. And yeah, thank you for your comment on path dependency. Just with the previous comment, I think the way you start your career in an organization, it is crucial, because especially when we talk about public organizations of culture, they still have like step ladder career tracks, but they are very, very slow. So if you start usually as a lab assistant, so they still have positions of laboratory assistant, although there are no labs obviously in big museums, just maybe few reservation labs, but that's more like exception. Yeah, so it might take you, the track to senior research fellow might take you like 20 years. And I witnessed in some of the interviews, like director of department calls a very like esteemed curator in her late 40s our youth. So you're still young in your late 40s, according to this career ladder, which is probably a good thing to be professionally young. And the last comment here is that actually it's all about females, but we have a male director here who hired this new neoliberal female manager, but he stays aside. So technically, he wasn't the one who fired the old tetushkas. So that's also interesting. Yeah, thank you for your question.
So, hello everyone. I'm Marine Biro. I'm the co-founder of the agency Artistic Bazaar, which is based both in Paris and in Moscow. I also created the website Arty Generation, and we are working now on launching Pulsar Moscow here. I will say a bit more about that later. So I'm not an academic, I'm an entrepreneur, and this talk today is not as formal as like demonstrating a thesis and so on. This is more likely a dive into some different artistic and cultural project management in the art field in France, where I come from, and in Russia, where I develop my business now. The idea is to try and identify trends and to learn from them, because I truly believe that it's from great examples and role models that we can build a strong and supporting community. So, in the beginning were the digital revolution, the so-called digital revolution that put on the front of the scene such values and practices like peer-to-peer collaboration, do-it-yourself remix, open source experimentation. They were already existing, of course, but they are now unavoidable sources of change in all the fields of our lives. They impacted the way we see the world, our relationship with others, and with art. They are endless inspiration and opportunities for business, and they are also disrupting the art world in different ways. This new paradigm is what led me to become an entrepreneur 4 years ago. And now it's still like an everyday invitation to never take anything for granted and question our practices in the light of our values that I hope you share: openness, collaborativeness, creativity. The consequences of this so-called digital revolution have been different in France and in Russia, and I will develop this a bit further. So first consequences is about the tradition of state support, which is diametrically opposite in France and in Russia, because in France, post-World War II period, we saw the birth of a Ministry of Culture, administering like a strong budget and supporting the creation of a network of institutions for both like performance and visual arts. Until now, even if public money have been decreasing, unfortunately, the scheme of art production articulates around state-funded institutions and programs. As an example, here you have the map of what is called scènes nationales, like national scenes. These are venues dedicated to performance art, mainly dance and theater, and there are 17 in France, financed by the state, regions, and other like administrative levels. In Russia, on the contrary, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if the Ministry of Culture is active, its field of action is more narrow, and projects older of medium and small sizes, like a non-profit organization or artistic collective, have little or no interaction with it. About the art market, in a whole, the digital revolution sped up its globalization, and we saw different new actors appeared, like online auctioneers and galleries, data aggregators, like Artsy, Blockchain Potential, and so on. We could dwell on it for hours. But first, what's interesting is that investment in the art market requires specific data and statistics. And digital actors provide that, like ArtPrice, ArtNet, ArtTactic, Mutual Art, and so on. Such platforms, they combine statistics from auction sales, analytics, and art market news. The digital revolution also allowed like new commercial channel to rise. Hiscox forecasts that by 2021, the online market could exceed $9 billion. It's highly competitive both for auction houses and online sales platforms such as Artsy again, or Invaluable and the Sales Room, and so on. You can see on the graphic here. In France, these new players, mostly from Great Britain and the US, have kind of diminished the way of the country, combined with the rise of the Asian market and the still emerging but dynamic Middle East market. So, like in a nutshell, competition has hardened, but Paris remained the fifth largest market in the world, and continue to hope to take over London and London like place in Europe. We'll see. In Russia, on the other hand, the digital revolution has got impact, but in a lesser extent, and even lesser for contemporary art, because due to like fiscal issues, structural characteristic, Russian market struggled to make its place. Even though Malevich today is now the 9th most expensive artist in modern painting, according to ArtPrice, and thanks to the last sale last year, the sale of the artwork, the Suprematist composition, that Christie sold for $85 million. Overall, my observation is that the Russian contemporary art market is still struggling against some issues, among which the importance of the grey market that prevents to build a proper artist rating on a global market, and the very little or virtually no state support that we could compare to other examples, like China, for example, who has a contemporary art market about the same age like that opened 25 years ago or so. Also about new ways of creating, change has been tremendous, especially in the art and science field. We saw like new devices and also new kind of arts appear, like web art, computer art, digital art, and so on. There are like many. What's interesting for me is that with this new application and new devices, innovation is like the big word now, and everybody has to be innovative, and especially creators and artists. So artists, they both undergo this injunction to be innovative and put it also at a distance, because creating something new has been their purpose for so long now, and even before everybody was talking about innovation. But still what I observe is that they are like, there is a small difference in the way in France and in Russia we tackle innovation. Because it appears to me that if we talk about innovation culture, in France it's beginning to be something that is important for people, at least some part of the country. We are like the self-proclaimed startup nation, and we saw that with the election of our current president, that one part of the country want to be agile, or at least say so. But on the other hand, the innovation culture in Russia, in my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is mostly still understand as like technologic innovation. Like the dream, the purpose is still to put someone on the moon, and maybe not to change mindset, but to create breakthrough, like technological breakthrough. It explained maybe why Russia was the country where kinetic art was born. And if today it's also changing the art world and the way artists are creating with a very dynamic and active community of media artists, it remains a niche in the artistic production overall. Eventually, what I believe is key for both countries in this period of transition between two civilizations is the dynamism of a new generation of cultural entrepreneurs. So they are emerging for different contexts in France and in Russia. They are living in a world promised to inevitable environmental clash. They have nothing to lose. They think fast. They have understood the capitalist rule enough to play with them. And sometimes they have this lucidity that leads them either to cynicism or to utopian views. But I really believe that they are political in the way they defend the sharing economy and the place of art in their lives and in the world. And from this context, we can observe many new business and new initiatives. Yes, so here are like few examples we can present, both in France and in Russia. It's interesting because these 4 companies I'm going to present, they are based on the similar business models and expectations. For example, Smart Art is a Russian agency. They are both representing artists and consulting about contemporary art. It was created only 2 years ago by Anastasia Karnayeva and Ekaterina Vinokurova. They already produced personal shows for most of their 10 artists in museums such as MoMA, Tretyakov Gallery and Shusev Museum. And at the same time, they are working for corporate collections, but most of all, educating a brand new generation of collectors. And they are trying to change the relationship between artists and galleries and find new revenues. At the same time, in London and Paris, MT Art Agency, it was created by a French girl, Marine Tanguy. And this is the first agency that focus on investing and supporting the artist rather than selling artwork. So actually they have this investor board, and when they decide to take an artist in, then they support his studio cost and so on. So I really believe that these are examples of cultural artistic companies, but also I truly believe that artists are real entrepreneurs today because they have to face the same challenges to do something new and get their hand dirty trying doing it because they are multitasker. They have also to make their product and artwork visible, and for that they don't fear the marketing. They have to choose the right people, like agent or distribution channel. They also have to choose business model. I wanted to talk about Durer, but maybe we'll choose contemporary artists because I don't have time for that. But it's interesting to see how creative they are in finding new sources of revenue. We see some example Masha Yankovskaya. On the top, she's very into merchandising her own artworks as well as doing a lot for personal branding. So you can love it or hate it, but actually she's very good at it, and she has very feedback. There are also this new trend of artists working for companies. You see the example of street artists. There is, for example, a commercial street art fresco, which in Moscow, the Atrium is a good example of because they ask so many street artists to work on their walls. You have also in the middle the artist Misha Most, who is a street artist, but here is just the égérie of Farfetch. So it's a fashion digital platform. And also another street artist is Stepan Krasnov. For example, he made a collaboration with Campo Viejo, so wine brand, to work on their bottle designs. So yeah, actually they don't fear the marketing, and we can think what we want from it, but actually it's also an opportunity for them. To finish, I wanted to talk about what is the last very interesting thing for me about our new way of working with a digital, post-digital revolution world is that it has been fostering collaboration. And today it's very easy to find whoever you want to work with, thanks to the internet. And it has been creating new communities of interest and creative communities as well. We created, to explore this, we created 2 years ago in Paris an art award, which is called Pulsar. It's based on a collaborative and creative process between artists and scientists. For me, it's a good case to study because we had 2 editions already, and we are launching Pulsar Moscow at the end of the year here. So the concept of the prize is that the call for application is open for artists and scientists with no limitation on their practices, and they just have to be open to collaboration. It's a very important base for this adventure to go well. Then after applying, we make them meet and interact so they can find a pair and decide to work together, so an artist and a scientist together. When they have found this perfect match, then they work on an art concept that they present, and we select 10 art concepts to invite them to some kind of hackathon week, very intense creative week of creation. It will be in Skolkovo next year. At the end of this hackathon, they have to present a prototype, and then the jury selects 3 prototypes for them to access the residency, produce the artworks, and then be part of the final exhibition. So this is a very new process for an art award, because we are not giving money or grant to an already existing artwork or career. This is really a way for us to experiment and to take the most of these test and learn culture that we are living in. So yes, to finish, I just wanted to share few good practices if you are interested in such kind of collaboration, because it really implies to create new language between artists and scientists. And I think that it doesn't really matter from where you stand. If you want to create new relations and great output and work together with people from a different world, these are some kind of tips that can be applied in all the field of our lives. So sorry, I wanted to say a lot, but if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting and very insightful talk. So any questions? Do you have oh, yes, we have. Okay. Then I'll go to you. Thank you.
It's a very simple one. When you talk about art market, online art market, can you more precisely define it a bit? Because it's huge figures, so it's the biggest players, or it's everything. Since I have a website, I sell a
everything
painting.
that was sold online.
Yeah, but I mean, it's any possible kind of. That's my main doubt. How it is quantified.
Does it include Etsy and so on, for example? These numbers are from the digital actors, on the art markets itself, not creative markets we can find with posters and reproductions and so on. So it's mostly from the one I quoted, so Artsy, Artprice, Christie's and Sotheby's online sales also, and all the galleries that had open online galleries, but it's from the art players. But the number I quoted, $9 billion, it's an estimation for 2021. So.
Oh, thank you. That was really interesting, and I definitely want to collaborate. Yeah. The question was about this well, if we might use this term, global Russians or these cultural entrepreneurs acting on the global scale, but from Russia. I'm just wondering, you had like, you mentioned that maybe not them, but they had no other choice or something like that. My question is about their biographies. Do you know something about them? Like what from cities, from what cities of Russia are they, and from social class? That's a very precise question, but
you're asking about like the Russian artists that are visible on the like global contemporary art market, where they come from.
Or entrepreneurs. Like, where they come from, what their story.
It's a very interesting question. Yeah. Maybe it's a very personal answer also. So what I find difficult when trying to understand what's going on here, because I'm very new here, I've been here for only 18 months, is that, and why the art market is not that reliable yet. It's because of this like all gray area. And if I'm very honest, a lot of galleries, for example, they are funded or supported. They are run by women most of the time, but they are supported by like family members, let's say father, brothers, husbands, and so on. And it's, I don't like saying that at all, but it appears to me that it's some kind of reality. And if we look at the history of the art market in Russia, like in the booming years, like early 2000s, the art prices were fixed on a quite random way. And so some things were sold very high, some other very low. It was like some kind of opportunities. And all that have been preventing the market to be really reliable. Because if as a gallery, you don't have to be financially sustainable because you have investors that don't really look at the numbers, then you don't really care about the price you set and if you have good feedback on your investment and so on. So this is one thing. Also, I was talking about the gray market because I think there is no such thing as a tax culture in Russia. So, and I can understand that, of course, it's easier to buy just from the artist without declaring it and so on. But this is what is also preventing this art market to be reliable, because it means that all these artwork that are sold on the gray market, they cannot really exist on the real market, on the like white market. So it means that for an artist, it's impossible to really build his reputation or rating, because let's say that half of his production is sold like and cannot be counted. So this is like a tricky thing for me, and I have no answer on how to like kind of solve it. I think it's a long process. It's already on the way. Like, for example, I was talking about Smart Art agency. So they have 10 artists. They helped their 10 artists creating EPs and so on. So this is like, as a artistic production agency, every day I'm contacting artists to be speakers or to like work with brands, but they have no EPs, for example, which is like the basic status if you want to develop some kind of revenues.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Of course, a question, a comment, if I may. The question is: so when you were kind of estimating what's going on, you actually meant money. That is, that there's cash or whatever, digital transfers, right? So when you talk about buying and selling, it's always about money, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so you didn't sort of look into, for example, when people just swap artworks, or you get, I don't know, a car for your painting or something like that.
I have no access.
Or you get 10,000 likes on Facebook as a kind of a value to that. I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, no, of course, I would love to have access to this information, but I know that it's already a struggle to have real numbers when money is involved. For example, In Art Agency here is doing annual reports about the actual amounts, like of money in the Russian art market. They're trying to aggregate numbers from auction houses, galleries, fairs, and so on. And it's already a challenge because, for example, if I'm correct, for the last annual report, so 2017, that was published last year, they had I think it's like 46% of galleries sharing the numbers. So you see that if you have like, it's half the half the market, and so it's still not enough. So for me, like the main goal would be to have 100% of the like official and monetized market, and then we could think about like all the truck and so on.
Well, my comment is that in relation to that, are you sure that you're actually empowering artists by just monetizing everything they do, and that perhaps you're in a way limiting their artistic expression? You're basically turning this all into this, Margaret Thatcher neoliberalism again.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say.
Yeah, I mean, there should be, spaces for public art or kind of any other art that cannot be in any way purchased.
Yeah. We talked about, like, we were talking about the art market. But what's interesting when we talk about developing new source of revenues, and what MT Art and Smart Art, for example, are doing, is that they are not focusing about selling artworks. Of course, if we talk about the art market, today, the definition of the art market is how, like, which artworks are sold and how much. But if we are thinking about how to support artists and their career and their forward thinking and so on, then it's all about developing new sources of revenue, because even though it's not, I mean, I hear what you say when you say it's maybe a limitation to think about how much they're worth. But it's also, let's be honest, today most of the Russian artists, they have nothing to live. I mean, it's not a very successful career or profitable one. So this is why by finding new sources of revenue, like developing some discussion with public organizations, state, like different level of the states for like like for like state organizations, state operations, like having public art or working with brands. It's this is interesting because this is not only focusing on selling artwork, but how artists are giving value to to the society they live in, because with their work, with their ideas, they are contributing to shaping the world to come. And but this is something that we really have to keep fighting for and educating people, both in organizations and in companies. This is something that is already, I think, quite integrated in like big company marketing departments, for example, to work with some kind of like what the artist can bring in term of image, not only PR but just image, and this is interesting. But still, for that, you need to have strong figures, artistic figures. There are some in Russia, of course, but because the brands that are the most ready to do this kind of thing, they are international brands, and so they use like international artist figures. So that's why it's like a whole process that needs to be like to step up to have like better results.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Ludmila for all your hard work. As Ludmila said, I will be talking, it's a very sort of a local presentation of a local practice that I'm hoping maybe could inspire others, and I'm very curious to hear feedback from you. I've never presented it before. I normally do my research on consumer behavior and themes of identity and gender, so this is a little bit different. It's more of a development project about a teaching format that we've developed at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. So all the images are images from student work. And this is, yes. The Royal Danish Academy is actually an old institution from 1875. And in 2010, we started a process of accreditation to become an institution of higher education. And that meant introducing research to the institution and research basing the teaching. And it posed quite a lot of problems because it's a practice-based institution, and sort of the university formats were sort of just adopted onto the institution with papers and lectures and things like that. And if you're a visual or a kinetic learner, it was not making a lot of sense to the students, so we were inspired to try to develop new formats, and this is what I will be presenting today. It's a format that we've been developing since 2015 at the fashion department, in order to sort of introduce the idea of theory, academic theory, and abstract concepts as a tool for concept development, and to strengthen the future students' abilities to argue for their work and engage in public discourse. A lot of, at least Danish fashion designers, but I think this also goes internationally, aren't as articulate about current affairs as I think they should be or could be. So it's sort of to strengthen their projects, find inspiration from different types of sources, and strengthen their ability to argue for their work. I wrote a paper on it that was published in the special issue of Russian Fashion Theory on Nordic Design. I think I will sort of go lightly over the more theory background of the method. I don't think that's quite as interesting in this context, but it's sort of taking Donald Schoen's idea of the reflective conversation a bit further, sort of encouraging students to not see only through visual mediums such as drawing, collage, draping, fabric, and experiments, but also allowing their process to be informed by academic texts. This idea of seeing as a form of artistic discovery that merges practices and theory, material, and thought for potentially innovative and novel approaches. This will all make sense to you in a little bit when I start unfolding what it is actually about. We've called the method LIFT, lab in fashion theory, sort of introducing theory into this sort of lab format, allowing sort of theory and experiment to meet. So it's sort of this idea of lifting theory into sort of the realm of artistic or design practice. Also sort of playing with this vertical motion between hand and mind. There's also often a perceived gap between theory and practice, and trying to sort of connect them in a different way. And there's also this idea of developing a stronger voice, lifting their voices into the public sphere, the future designers, in order to navigate this shifting landscape that fashion designers are facing, especially in terms of sustainable developments, which is a huge challenge for the fashion industry. The images are from, the one on the left is from a session, a teaching session, and the one on the right is from a session on body awareness that I'll return to. A student sort of cast her own body in plaster, and we had a nice discussion about how fashion forms the body. I'll return to that. The process is sort of loosely based on, I don't know if you're familiar with the sprint method developed by Google Ventures. It's originally designed to sort of merge business strategy, innovation, behavior science, design thinking, and more in order to sort of facilitate quicker decision making. So we borrowed that format into our context with the lift. So a lift week. A lift process takes a week, and we normally have 3 consecutive weeks that are often followed by a design project. So it's something that kickstarts a process, so it can be followed by a project and or a theory paper. So I'll just quickly go through the week process, and then afterwards I'll unfold the results and give you a sense of the process through examples. So on the Monday, It's very down to earth. It's a very down to earth presentation. On the Monday, the students will have prepared by reading a number of texts. We often select 2 academic texts and 1 text from a newspaper to have a more current edge. But we also sometimes have nonfiction. It can be all types of texts. And the week will have a theme. This could be a more abstract theme, phenomenology or French deconstruction, or it could have a more sort of current theme, such as we had the example of body, gender, cultural appropriation, things that are sort of topical. And also I like to select topics that can help the students sort of avoid a lot of trouble. I can give you some examples later. Fashion designers and fashion houses tend to get into trouble, especially these days. So trying to, so the first day we have a study group where we discuss the texts and the themes. We also often find, I don't know if anybody can recognize this, but we have a number of students who feel that they are sort of intimidated by academic theory and they feel stupid. They may have bad experiences from their previous schooling. So we found that having this sort of study group where we sit in a circle and we discuss these texts seems to have a positive effect on the students. They seem more relaxed and are allowed to be curious and engaged instead of feeling sort of alienated by the academic texts. And one way of facilitating this sort of positive engagement is that each student brings an object, a visual of some sort. It can be a film, a photo, something they produced themselves that relates to the theme. And it can be a way of engaging themselves and also sort of engaging the group in this discussion. As a way of discussing academic texts, but in a little bit of a different way. And one example I could maybe give is that we had, we've had a little bit about today and yesterday about body identity and gender identity. So maybe this example would be interesting. We had one student who brought an elastic band. I don't know what it's called, like a long one that you use if you've had an operation in your stomach. And she brought it, and people didn't really exactly know what it was, and it went around the circle. Maybe we were often 15 to 18 students in a group, and it's both bachelor's and master's, or we do this format on both levels. Anyway, she brought this object as her contribution to the discussion about gender and body identity. And she explained that when she really wants to look really nice, she wears the elastic so it covers her breasts, so she can look flat. So that was a very personal, but also a very interesting contribution to the discussion, just to give you a sense of how it works. Okay, back to the week plans that we discuss, and that's where the idea is that this is supposed to trigger some thoughts, some ideas, something they feel they want to explore further. So on the Tuesday, there's a supervision by a teacher. We're often a practice-based and a theory-based teacher. I don't have a practice background myself. And then we talk to the students about how they want to proceed during the week. And then on the Wednesday, they have to decide on an idea of how they want to sort of engage in the topic of the week through some sort of visual form. On the Thursday, they have to finish it. And on the Friday, we present it, or they present it in a gallery setting. We go to a space and they hang it up as if it was a gallery. I should just go back real quick. We did this 2 weeks ago. They were hanging their stuff up. Sorry. There. And then we invite students to critique each other. So you don't present your own work. You present somebody else's work as a way of sort of experiencing how what you sent out is not always what's being read. That's a good practice to have before you have to go out into the real world. You might be communicating something completely different than you intended. So that's often a very nice way of finishing the week. It's also a way of sort of making it not so dangerous or sort of intimidating to present your work, so making them more comfortable. Lordy, time goes fast. Oh. I'm going to speed it up. Okay, so these are examples of things that things students have done during this LIFT format. This is about body and gender. They're not from the same year. The one to the left is a student sort of trying to explore all the different women that are living inside of her in a little bit of a humoristic way. The next one is trying to sort of explore, and I think it's important to say that we encourage them to sort of think of these things as sketches or experiments or something that could be the beginning of something. It doesn't have to be finished. It can be a comment. It can be a statement. So the second one to the left is a student exploring where is gender placed in fashion? What happens if you take the gendered body out? When is it gendered? And he did it through posing. He was sort of exploring the posing of the clothes without the body, which I thought was a pretty interesting experiment. The next one is actually from a couple of weeks ago. I just finished a course before I got here, exploring the idea of gendered fabrics or gendered textiles. When are they male? When are they female? What happens if you assemble them in a more of a collage? And the one to the right is also from a couple of weeks ago, sort of playing with this idea of hair being the site of gender or site of femininity. So she cut a lot of her hair off and she knitted this hat, which has her ponytail like this. Sort of a conceptual comment on what if you could just sort of take your femininity on and off. I thought that was really nice. So there's been a lot, I don't know, I'm not sure how many fashion people are here, but I'm sure a lot of people are aware of how the fashion industry can sort of bump into sort of a cultural appropriation or a shaming or a disrespectful output. There's been a lot of that recently. We were discussing the Gucci blackface turtleneck and things like that. So this is sort of about when is it inspiration, when is it appropriation, this difficult balance that fashion designers are always confronted with. The one to the right is I don't know, maybe Danish porcelain is very inspired by China, but we think of it as very Danish, so it's sort of a good example of this sort of cultural borrowing. So she did this, she embroidered this white privilege installation with the merging of the East and the West in the porcelain. And in the middle, a student who's half Iranian struggled a little bit with this double identity. She went into a store where they sold things that you could buy in the Middle East and bought a quilt, and she made a coat out of it to sort of make it her own. And on the left is sort of an example of a gallery presentation where we're discussing. And actually Cengiz, he did a burqa that he wore all day, also in the bus home, just to see how it feels. It's sort of also having this sort of embodied experience of all the things that we read and we talk about, but how does it feel if you actually perform it yourself? He actually enjoyed wearing the face mask. We've talked about when is something an original, when is something a copy. Copying is sort of ingrained in the fashion industry. So what happens if you sort of explicitize it? So she knitted a sweater that had all different kinds of fashion brand names. It's been featured in Vogue. She's built a whole career on it. Moving along a little more quickly. So on the master level, we have a more philosophical course. This was more contemporary events. So this is an example of working with French deconstruction. On the left is the experiment she did that sort of challenges or explores the tension between what happens if you go between 3D and 2D. What she did was she photocopied clothing and put it on foam, so it had this sort of, it was both 3D and 2D, and she sort of toyed with the idea of the tension between art and fashion and original and copy. And it actually became the starting point for her master's collection, and she just got a job 2 weeks ago at Margiela. Maison Margiela. So I thought that was nice that it came out of a theory course. And the last example, also from a master's course, we talked about phenomenology. They read texts by Merleau-Ponty and Mark Patterson, who's interested in the haptic sense. And she was interested in when does the body start and when does fashion start and when does it end. So she was toying with the idea of it merging together in the example on the left, with the the accessory or the bag sort of became a prolongation of her body, and it also actually triggered her final graduation collection, and you can sort of see the link. So as a sort of a laboratory of discovery and artistic development, but actually having academic theory trigger it, is something that we've experimented with. Thank you.
Yeah, since I started, probably. Thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. So, and actually just to contextualize, that talk was scheduled within the frame of a roundtable discussion on perspectives of education, especially higher level of education in the field of art and design. And we were going to talk about this practice-based, theory-based research and work. So that was just the context. If there are any questions, comments, okay.
Thank you very much. It's kind of really inspiring because we're all forced to do this sort of research-led teaching, and that's a great example. But I wonder how the students reflect actually on the process, whether there's any moment during the term when they sort of pause and they kind of, because it seems like, you know, it's a bit of a kind of a roller coaster, you know, theory Monday, exhausting, you know, from a student perspective. So how do you work with their kind of motivation? How do you work with their long-term learning objectives?
See, I should have brought a student, because now I can say whatever. I can say they love it. But they actually do love it, because it's the theory becomes operational for them. They feel that they can engage. They don't feel alienated. I think sometimes with a lecture, they just don't know where to hang it in their head. It is a little stressful. We always have on the first Tuesday, they're like, I'm not ready. But there's something, they find there's something productive about having to take quick decisions. Maybe your first idea was the good one, run with it, and they don't do it forever and ever. Afterwards, they have a project that lasts for 8 weeks. So it's just sort of it's a good Kickstarter. It also sort of, it tricks them out of getting too caught up in their head about I'm stupid or I don't know, or so they actually, I can just say this and I could be lying, but I'm not. They are so happy and enthusiastic that they are.
Okay.
And it also, often if they're having trouble writing theory papers, this is when they sort of can snap out of it. Because they feel they can have a voice. I mean, art students want to feel that they have a voice and that it makes sense to them. So, and I think we have external examiners and they say the level is under marks. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, my question was about the final product that they make. Is it always more kind of artistic product, or you work also, or you try to work also with sort of mass market or possible mass market product? Because one thing is like from deconstruction to basically artistic object, right? And another thing from deconstruction of phenomenology or whatever to the product that can be actually bought. And that also makes kind of new questions for them, I guess, about the audience, about their kind of particular people that they would deal with. Because, yeah, my first thought when you just started the presentation is that how rarely in Denmark, like in Copenhagen more often, but in the rest of Denmark, in smaller cities, how rarely you see people at least that colorful, in that colorful clothes, and there is a sense, at least from the presentation, maybe just visual, there is certain disruption between, you know, mass audience, mass market, and what your students are doing. Yeah. So kind of how it's connected.
That's a good question. The study or the whole master's program, bachelor master's program, is organized around 3 sort of pillars. One is the artistic development, one is the academic theory, and one is design process. So this is just a little tiny, this last course I just did was 2 weeks, and it's leads up to a design project, but also to a theory paper. So this is actually a theory course. They have plenty of courses where they collaborate with big brands and they do lineups and all the commercial stuff. So this is just part of, this is merging the artistic and the academic in little pockets. That's actually facilitating the academic work. And I have to say, this girl, Anne, she got a job right away with actually a mid-market brand by Malene Biver. So it doesn't necessarily exclude, working artistically doesn't necessarily prohibit getting a job in the commercial world. I think a lot of brands, most brands will be able to see how we can just turn that down a little bit and then it can work. But I have to say a lot of our graduates do start working abroad to begin with the big brands. Because Danish fashion is very, very mid-market, and we all look very black and gray.
Okay.
Hello, yeah,
Hello.
fantastically interesting, and I would like to have all of that in my possession. But my question is about how do you find theoretical inspiration, and how do you choose theories, and what are the challenges? Like in my particular interest, like did you try to work with post-human, non-human theories?
To answer your first question first, I feel that they also should, there's certain classics that I think they feel they should know, because a lot of the work that comes after rests on it. And then I try to select theory. For instance, Merleau-Ponty, I think he writes very visually, so it actually appeals to them quite well. They compute quite quickly to Merleau-Ponty. I try to listen to what they're interested in at a given time, so I often change the curriculum. Right now they're very interested in gender fluidity, and there's a heavy sort of cultural appropriation theme that can just really get them into a lot of trouble if they don't think. So I'm interested in sort of having them sort of schooled into the traditional classics, but also preparing them to navigate in this sort of really complicated fashion industry. As for the non-human, no, I haven't. Do you have a good idea? Do you have a suggestion?
But I'm just wondering, can any theory can be turned into clothes?
I bet they could.
Yeah.
But I do use fashion theory. For this last course, I used Lars Svensson, a Norwegian philosopher who I think is really good. Elizabeth Wilson. We did Bruggemann, who did Anne Flisco for the cultural appropriation about textiles. Yeah, I try to sort of make it the high enough level, but not to sort of just alienate them.
Yeah, but post-human can, I think, cyborg body and all
okay,
those.
yes, we have
so
that.
there are so many things, and it's the field which is developing very fast. We actually have a PhD student here who is doing research on jewelry, new type of jewelry, and non-normative body. And cyborg body is one of the. Yes.
You could do a whole theme on that. I haven't done that. That's a good idea.
Okay.
I'm doing it.
Okay. So thank you so much for your fantastic presentation again. And thank you so much, colleagues, for this inspiring panel.
I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person. What I'm going to do is give you a kind of roundup, an account of what we might describe as a new urban political economy of fashion. This work has emerged from our study of micro-enterprises and startups based on interviews, observations, and studio visits in London and Berlin and Milan from 2013 to 2017. This work has really led us to think very emphatically about what we might call social future for fashion. And the social future for fashion we envisage takes three particular forms. First of all, we want to make a case for a new area of study, and that area would be called fashion policy studies. And this would be a field of research which would be particularly investigating organizational and institutional structures, as well as the working lives of people in this sector. Secondly, we want to flag up fashion's egalitarian potential. That is to say, we envisage the fashion industry as something that can be much more widely spread out, much more regional, more local, more diverse, and more embedded. And thirdly, we want to draw attention to digital fashion and to the issues that come up from online fashion, the decline of retail, and the new kinds of jobs that emerge with online fashion. So they're the areas that we think are particularly important for now. And as you should be able to see in slide 3, one of the most significant aspects of our study has been an emphasis on the idea of fashion social enterprise. And we found fashion social enterprises most developed and most interesting in Berlin. And you can see from one of the slides, Rita in Palma. And this is an accessories company with a very strong connection to the neighborhood of Neukölln. And we did a lot of study inside this particular social enterprise, and I'll come back to it later. You'll see in the following slide a picture of my colleague Marty Henschel, also from Berlin. And Marty Henschel was a pioneer of fashion social enterprises in the city. And I'll say a little bit more about what she has done in the next few minutes. So let me run through what I see as proposal number 1 for the development of critical fashion policy studies. First of all, I suggest that we pay attention to the labor of new supply chains across the sector. That is to say, all the way from the design end right down to the guys who are delivering the packages from DPD or Hermes or Zalando. So I want to suggest that we really investigate the terrain of fashion in its supply chains, not just the supply chains that connect designers with manufacturers in cheap labor companies, but also, if you like, internal supply chains. Secondly, I suggest that we critique what I define as top-down approaches. In the UK, the fashion sector has been completely dominated by a top-down approach. That is to say, led by the British Fashion Council and by the online journal Business of Fashion. And the domination from this top-down perspective, for example, the British Fashion Council, who they speak to, who they want to speak to, inevitably this has led to what I would say is an over-corporatization effect with a marginalization of social agendas. The next proposal I make is one that would suggest changes to fashion pedagogy, questioning the curriculum, perhaps colonizing the curriculum, but also introducing a more social agenda for the curriculum. This proposal emerges very much from the new socio-political climate. That is to say, the new age of feminist activism, the important role of anti-racist perspectives, and questions of class and access to the fashion industry. There has been a good deal of recent research on who gets access, who are the privileged sectors in the fashion sector. We also have become critical of the London model, which we could define as very much exemplifying a neoliberal ethos of winner takes all. And winner takes all also means at the lower end, a reliance on unpaid internships, on working for low pay or no pay. And finally, in relation to London, we raised the question of how social are the social enterprises in London. Actually, London talks about social enterprises. There are some in existence, but we saw them very much as led by, again, a strong corporate business agenda, with the social element completely marginalized. Okay, so that's very much the proposals that would entail a critique of the corporate top-down London winner-takes-all ethos. Our second proposal comes very much out of the research that we've been doing, and it really is more positive and focuses on the idea of capacity and potential to, if you like, socialize fashion. This comes out of our in-depth studies in Berlin. And in Berlin, what we really found was that a proactive city council set of initiatives that provided support for fashion startups and fashion micro-enterprises permitted the flowering of a much more extensive and a much more lively and animated and socially connected form of social fashion practice. So we found subsidized space, which demonstrated social value in the neighborhood. That is to say, programs where young designers would find support and would get help with equipment and with space in good locations if they made it clear that they were prepared to work within the community and work with the neighborhood. And this really means working with disadvantaged people, with young women coming out of school without qualifications, with, if you like, extending a social role into the neighborhood. In Berlin, we also found that the winner-takes-all model was not relevant. Instead, the design practices that we found were much more intersecting with each other. So, for example, we found the avant-garde designers, which did exist, nevertheless connected with social enterprises and also connected with very small-scale micro-producers. So there was the different kinds of fashion. Of course, there was an avant-garde. Of course, there were, if you like, more middle-range designers. And there were also micro-producers, women working at home, knitting, sewing, on a very isolated basis. But what we found was that there was a greater degree of connection and communication across these different layers of design. So in sum, we would say there was a non-elitist ethos in the city. And last but not least, we also found that there was no stigma against low wage earners. There was no stigma against people who were working in the sector on, if you like, welfare to work schemes. And this then, if you like, demonstrated the values of, if you like, social democracy in practice. So people who were working on a low income were as much a part of the fashion scene as people who were more well-known, more established with a catwalk show. And the value here then was very much on, again, the city supporting unemployment schemes, the city supporting welfare to work schemes, and also fashion designers themselves often teaming up with other professionals, cultural geographers, social geographers, to apply for European social funds. So as you can see from the slides that I'm sure Ludmila is demonstrating, we have lots of quotes from Berlin, which I'm not going to go through right now. I'm going to leave those slides for you to look at, that Ludmila will be showing, and I'm now going to say a little bit more critical about London and why London has become a negative place for the fashion sector. First of all, the winner takes all ethos means competition, prizes, a lot of attention given to a very small number of people every year. Nobody asks what happens to those small prize winners 5 or 10 years down the line. The winners that we did work with demonstrated to us the extent to which there was exhaustion, exploitation, and what we might call winner overload. This also led us to suggest that even the prize winners end up in a precarious situation. We talked about the precarity of success. That is to say, the winners might be seen as very successful, but within 3 or 4 years, either they were doomed to a kind of burnout, or the support that they were getting from sponsorship and endorsements would dry up and would be gone. In London, the only people that we found that were able to maintain a practice were young people, actually no longer quite so young, who had developed a career before the period of austerity. That is to say, we found a cohort who were maybe now in their late 30s, early 40s. They had found ways of creating self-organized professional urban networks. And they had formed very supportive and very cohesive friendship networks, which meant that they were able to carry on with their own work. However, even they tended to increasingly to have their own label or their own collection in a small corner of their working lives. And instead, they also had jobs, maybe working for a bigger company 3 or 4 days a week. Working for Ted Baker, for example. Young people we found to be completely priced out of London. Finally, in Milan, this was so interesting to us. In Milan, there were no creative economy policies at all. These kind of things didn't exist. And instead, there was recognition of very high levels of graduate unemployment. And the people that we interviewed were very open about how devastating psychologically the impact of unemployment was for them. However, what we also found was that there were indeed really tiny micro enterprises springing up in Milan and on the outskirts, where eventually graduates would find ways of connecting with each other and beginning to work and to produce some items, selling them online or developing their own small shops. So they said that what we found then in Milan was terribly interesting because it was a psychological, emotional scenario where unemployment was prompting young people to eventually try to set up as cultural creative entrepreneurs, still reliant often on their parents, still living at home, but feeling so much better when they were actually producing clothes, producing bags, making dresses, and developing their own entrepreneurial skills. And indeed, those who were more successful and those who had been doing it for a longer time were increasingly able to plug into traditional Italian skill bases, such as artisanship, relearning local knowledge, instinctive and inherited skills. And so we call this an example of gendered social innovation, because in the past where these skills in Milan, also in Florence, working with silks, working with leather, making bags and so on, where this had been very much dominated by men, this had been a male skill, what we found were young women reviving the idea of the post-industrial district. And you can see that in some of our some of our Italian slides. So finally, our proposal 3 was how to rethink, how to engage with the growth of online fashion and with e-commerce. And what we discovered was that online sales and the speed with which consumers were switching to buying online and less concrete sales, less retail centered, we found that this was having a very negative impact on young and small scale designers. And so we argued that it was here that there needed to be better investment, better social investment to support young designers who were going to be increasingly reliant on online sales. So we wanted to find ways of developing a social model for new e-commerce. And this is something that one of our colleagues in Berlin, Marty Henschel, who I showed you a picture of her, has been working recently on Sourcebook Berlin, which is a social investment model for online sales. So to sum up, on the online e-commerce, we see great difficulties for young designers being able to compete with the huge giants of Zalando or Yoox, who can deliver, who can package, who can deal with high rates of returns. Our designers were finding the ethos of returning clothes, returning items incredibly difficult for their cash flow. So to sum up, we want to make an argument for government investment in fashion micro enterprises at every level. We want to develop a holistic model which takes into account low-wage work at the bottom end, including delivery guys in vans. But we also want to kind of propose a social model for critical fashion studies. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. So interesting and visionary. I had one question in terms of proposal 3. Where would you place something like Etsy in that? Which sort of,
I'm sorry, I can't hear the last part of your question.
Where would you place Etsy, the website?
Oh, Etsy. Oh, good point. Yes, good point. Okay, so I think in order to answer your question, we really would need to have a kind of overview of ongoing research precisely on the more independent, very small scale activities of fashion producers. Etsy, from our study, was very much a beginning and a start point for people, for example, in Italy, who were working at home, making clothes and dresses and using Etsy as a first point of call. But actually, our interests were more in as they became more professionalized. And one of the companies that we worked with, you could look up immediately, you probably know, Not Just a Label. And they offered, if you like, a much more precise kind of design service. Of course, Etsy is much more, takes one into the world of craft and into really small scale producers. We were absolutely interested in people who self-defined as professional, qualified fashion designers, who had done the training, whether in the UDK in Berlin or Weissensee or in the Politecnico in Milan or in London College of Fashion or Central St. Martin's. And they tended to be less drawn to Etsy.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.